So do you want to include third-party apps into your Windows setup media? Well, today I'm going to show you how to do it, and it's actually pretty easy. Stay tuned. Now, I've shown you how to build many custom installs of Windows 10 and 11. Most of the time, this is for debloating, but I've also shown you how to build custom installs that bypass the Windows 11 system requirements or even the Microsoft account requirements. However, in every one of those videos, I get people in the comments asking me how they can include third-party apps into the setup so they don't have to install them after they install Windows. Now, I've never done a video on that because, to be honest with you, I've never had a process that actually worked. But now I do, and that's what we're going to be doing today. But first, I got to pay some bills, so check out today's sponsor. Is your copy of Windows 10 unactivated? Well, it doesn't have to be, because with today's sponsor, VIP SCD Key, you can get a valid Windows 10 license for under $20. Stop dealing with that stupid watermark on the desktop, the valid license for Windows 10. Also, with an activated copy of Windows 10, you can upgrade to Windows 11 for free. Just go to the link in the description below and pick up a valid Windows 10 license key. During checkout, use the code CYBERCPU for a 25% discount. Once you have your key, go to your activation settings in Windows 10 and click on the link that says Change Product Key. Enter the product key you just purchased and hit Activate. Now you don't have to deal with that stupid watermark that come with running an unactivated copy of Windows 10. Now, on with the video. So, one of the things that I end up spending a tremendous amount of time doing is setting up Windows after I do a fresh install. Now, if you don't help customers on a regular basis, then you probably don't spend anywhere near as much time as I do. But every single time I set up Windows, I have to set up numerous third-party programs. And considering the fact that I'm always installing the same programs on the systems that I set up, it would be nice if I could just include that with the Windows setup and not have to deal with it afterwards. Well, it turns out that you can, and it's not very hard. In fact, we're using all Microsoft tools today to do just that. This is how manufacturers like Dell and HP create their restore disks. We're just going to be creating our own restore disk with the programs that we want on them. So let's jump on the computer and I'll show you how to do it. Okay, so here we are in Windows 11. The same thing can be done in Windows 10. Honestly, right now we're just using a host operating system. The majority of our work we're going to be doing in VirtualBox now. We're going to have to set up Windows a couple times in this video, so we're going to be doing all that from VirtualBox. We're just going to be setting everything up from within Windows 11, but you can do this on Windows 10 too. It'll work exactly the same. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to get some tools, and the tools that we're going to need is VirtualBox, obviously, because we're going to need VirtualBox to set up what's going to eventually become our install of Windows. And then we want to get Rufus so we can create a USB drive for our Windows install. And then we also are going to need a Windows PE install, because we're going to do a lot of this work of creating this image from within Windows PE. Now, I'm going to be using Hiren's BootCD, but you don't have to use Hiren's BootCD. However, if you want to follow my process, it's a free Windows PE install, and it's really easy to get. So the first thing we're going to do is go ahead and download all of these. And for VirtualBox, we're just going to go ahead and click on the Windows hosts platform. Now, if you're doing this on a different, like if you're doing this on Linux or Mac OS, you can do that as well. You'll just have to download VirtualBox for those, and then you'll have to figure out something else for Rufus, because I don't think Rufus is cross-platform. So once you download the Windows host or whatever host that you're going to be using, you also need to download the VirtualBox extension pack. So go ahead and click on that and install that also. And then from there, we're going to go ahead and download Rufus. And for that, we're just going to scroll down here and we're going to install. Now, I really like to get the portable version. I never download the installed version. So I would recommend getting the portable. It works exactly the same. So go ahead and click there and download that. And then the next one we're going to get is our Hiren's BootCD. Now, this is a 3 GB file. So if you're on a slow internet connection, it might take you a minute to download it. In fact, I'm on a fast internet connection and it's still going to take me about a minute to download. So, and that's actually pretty good. It's actually taken me longer to download Hiren's BootCD in the past. So once you get all those downloaded, then we can move on to the next step, which the next step is going to be using Rufus to create an ISO. So to do that, we're just going to go into downloads and we're going to go ahead and launch Rufus. And then from here, go ahead and hit yes. And then it's going to ask you if you want to allow Rufus to check for application updates online. Now you have to say yes to this because of the way we're using Rufus. So go ahead and hit yes to this right here. And what we need Rufus for is we need to get the ISO for our Windows 11 system. And to do that, we're just going to go ahead and change the select here from select to download. And this is why you have to say yes in that thing, because you have to give Rufus permission to access the internet. If you don't do that, it won't allow you to download ISOs. So go ahead and click on download here, and it'll download a list of different ISOs. Now, we're going to be doing a version of Windows 11. You can do this with Windows 10 as well if you want, but we're going to be doing this for Windows 11. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Windows 11, hit continue. And then from there, we're just going to go ahead and get the latest build. Looks like that's the only one that's available on Rufus anyway. We're going to go ahead and get Home, Pro, and Education. And then wait a minute here, and then we should be able to pick our language. Now, it's really important that you use the same ISO from beginning to end during this process. So I'm going to go ahead and pick the English United States because I'm in the United States. But go ahead and pick whatever language that you want to use, and then make sure that the ISO that you download is going to be the ISO that you use through this whole process. That's extremely important. So now go ahead and hit continue again. And right here, it's going to ask architecture. For Windows 11, 64 is all we have. Now, I'm going to hit download using the browser because I want the ISO file. So go ahead and hit download, and it will start downloading the Windows ISO file. And this is going to take a couple minutes to download. Okay, now the reason why we're downloading the ISO and not just creating a USB drive from the very beginning is because we're going to be creating a VM, and we need that ISO in order to install Windows onto the VM. It's a lot more difficult getting VirtualBox to boot from a USB thumb drive than it is an ISO. So I'm using the ISO just to install the initial Windows 11 install that we're going to modify in order to create our image. Now, it's going to take a minute for this to download, but once it does, go ahead and get yourself a USB thumb drive. Now, keep in mind, normally you're going to want an 8 gig thumb drive in order to make a Windows install, but depending on how many programs that you plan on including, it's going to create a really large Windows install file. So you might want to get a bigger one. I think this one here is a 128 gig. However, it doesn't necessarily have to be that big. This just happened to be the one that I had for this video. But you're probably going to need something bigger than an 8 gig. So I would say probably a 16 or 32 gig thumb drive would probably be okay. But like I said, it depends on how many programs you plan on installing, because it could get really big. Anyway, let's jump back on it. Okay, so now our Windows 11 ISO is downloaded. We can go ahead and minimize Chrome now. And then at this point right here, we're gonna go back into Rufus. And as you can see, it already has detected my thumb drive because I put it in the computer. And then we wanna go ahead and switch from download back to select. And then click the select button. And then we wanna grab in our downloads folder the Windows 11 23H2 ISO that we downloaded previously. And then go ahead and hit OK. And then at this point, everything else you should be able to leave standard. And then you wanna push the start button. Now, once you push the start button, it's going to ask you if you want to customize the installation. Now, you can do this if you want. If you want to remove the hardware requirements and the Microsoft account requirements, then that's fine. Go ahead and check those. These will add those options to the USB installer. However, it's not going to help us much at this point because this USB installer that we're going to be creating is something that we're going to be using later on in the video. We're not going to be using it to install the initial copy of Windows 11, if that makes any sense, but I'll show you in the next step. However, on mine, I already have this all done, so I'm going to go ahead and hit cancel, but all you have to do is hit OK, and it'll start creating the USB drive. So at this point, once you finish that, the next thing to do is we need to create a Windows 11 VM. And to do that, we go ahead and open up VirtualBox. And as you can see, I already have it installed on mine, but once you download the program itself, it's really easy to install. Essentially, all you got to do is go ahead and run the installer like you would any other program, and it'll install VirtualBox. And then once you install it, you want to make sure to install the VirtualBox extension pack. And by doing that, once VirtualBox is installed, the extension pack will automatically be associated with it. So all you have to do is double click on it, and it'll ask you if you want to upgrade it. As you can see on mine, I've got an older version, so I'm going to go ahead and hit upgrade on mine. And then you go ahead and scroll down, hit agree, and it will install the extension pack into VirtualBox. But once that's finished, what we want to do is create a Windows 11 VM. And for that, we're going to go to Machine, we're going to hit New, and then for this, we're just going to call it Windows 11. For the ISO image, we're going to go ahead and select the ISO image that we just downloaded. Now, keep in mind, you want to use exactly the same ISO image that you used to create your USB thumb drive. I can't reiterate this enough. That's extremely important. You don't want to accidentally create your image using an English International copy of Windows with the USB using an English United States version of Windows, it will error out during the install. So you want to make sure you use the same ISO to create your thumb drive as you do to create your image that we're going to be doing right now. So once you do that, go ahead and hit open. And then I like to hit skip unattended installation. And that's because I'm going to make some changes that it wouldn't make otherwise. So go ahead and check that and hit next. And then for base memory, 496 is fine. I like to increase this to 4 cores, but this is going to depend on how many cores your system has. If you have a quad core CPU, don't set it to 4 cores. It'll make your system unusable. And then also you want to make sure to leave yourself some free memory too, but 4 gigs is enough. And then go ahead and hit next. Now 80 gigs is not going to be enough for our hard drive because we're going to be installing software. So I'm going to put mine up to 250 gigs and then hit next. And then at that point we can hit finish. And now, once we hit start, it should start the Windows 11 setup. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. And now keep in mind that we're going to be using a vanilla copy of Windows 11 to do this. However, we won't have to worry about doing a Microsoft account because we're actually going to bypass the entire account creation process completely. And I'll show you that once we get to it. But this one right here, you should be able to just set up Windows 11 just how you normally would. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and skip through all of this setup because it's pretty normal like you would normally see. And then I'm going to go ahead and meet you when we finally get to the out-of-box experience, which is the last stage in the Windows 11 setup, where it has you pick what networks you're on, what your user accounts are, and stuff like that. Once we get to that point, then things are going to be a little bit different, but I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead to that, and I'll see you then. Now, what we're going to be doing, and the reason why we don't have to worry about account setups and stuff like that now, is because we're not actually going to create an account. The whole purpose of what we're doing right now is creating an image for setup, and for that, we can do that in audit mode. We don't actually have to create an account. So when the out-of-box experience starts, we're going to jump into audit mode and then install all of our programs and stuff like that. And then we're going to be able to kind of put the system into more of a limbo state. So then that way, once we set it up, there won't already be an account on the computer. But I'll show you how to do that once we get back to it. So once the out-of-box experience starts, I'll meet you there. Okay, here we are in the out-of-box experience. Now, at this point, you don't have to go any further in the setup. Windows is as set up as it's ever going to be, at least for this run right here. So what I want you to do now is you want to hit Control-Shift-F3. And by hitting that, you're essentially going to reboot the computer into audit mode. And then once we're in audit mode, we can make all the changes we want to Windows. And then at that point, we're going to go ahead and system prep it and then image it so we can make it an installer for Windows. But it's going to take a second to boot into audit mode. And then once it's there, we'll continue on. Okay, so here we are in audit mode. It's just finishing booting. As you can tell, it's using the built-in administrator account for audit mode. And that's essentially what audit mode does, this is before any accounts are created. So we're using the built-in administrator account. The nice thing about that is we don't need administrator access to install anything. We can do it all because we are the administrator right now. So the first thing you're going to see when it boots up is the system prep tool. So we can go ahead and cancel that. We're going to load it again later, but for right now, we don't need it. What we do need to do is install some applications. So at this point, installing applications is all up to you. You can go on the internet and start downloading them and setting them up like you would a normal system. Or I'm going to use Nite, which is essentially a program that will automatically install programs for you. In fact, I'm going to use the same Nite installer that I typically use on customers' computers because that's the image that I want to create in the first place. However, go ahead and collect all the software that you want and install it on your system, and then we can move on to the next step. Okay, so I'm going to install all the applications that I want on my image right now. And there's my applications installed. Now, these are the applications that I typically include on customer systems, and they're just basic applications for basic functionality. Like, obviously, it's a better browser than Microsoft Edge. You guys can pick whichever one you want. I went ahead and I typically install a PDF reader. I install an application that you can use to burn CDs, as well as an art program, and of course, VLC media player. So once you have all of these installed, now at this point, you can make whatever other modifications that you want to Windows 11 before we go and set up the system prep. But once you do the system prep, you're going to be done with that, and we're going to move on to the next step. Now, when you're doing this, you can essentially make any change that you want in Windows that applies to all users. Obviously, you can go ahead and change the background and stuff like that, but that's not going to apply because that doesn't apply to all users. It'll only apply to the administrator account. And since the administrator account is rarely used, it's not going to really make much of a difference. So go ahead and make whatever changes that you want to make to the system that apply to all users. Like if you want to put your own custom logo on the background, make sure you put it in the all users folder and it will be applied to the image. You can also change the OEM info on the system and that'll get applied to the new image as well. So those are things that if you're a system integrator, it might be helpful for you to do. If you're just a regular user, then the apps might be all you want to do. But either way, we're going to jump back on it and I'll show you the next step. Okay, so at this point, it's really simple. All we're going to do is going to go ahead and open File Explorer. We're going to go to this PC. We're going to go down to the C drive, and then we want to go into Windows. We want to scroll down to System32. And then from this point, we want to find the system prep folder or the sysprep folder. So we're going to scroll down. It's all alphabetical order. So we're going to look for SY, sysprep right here. And then we want this program here. And once we open that, it's going to give us our system prep. This is the same prompt we had when we first started Windows and that I closed. Essentially, we're just restarting it again. Now, we want to go ahead and enter the system's out-of-box experience, the OOBE, and then we want to change the shutdown option from restart to shutdown. And then at that point, once we hit OK, it'll shut down the system. And then we can move on to the next step. Now, it might take it a minute to shut down because it's going to shut it down the normal way that you would shut down Windows after it goes and does the cleanup phase and things of that nature. But once it's finished and shuts down, then it's ready to get an image taken of it. All right, so at this point, we're going to go ahead and load this again, but we're going to do things a little bit differently. So we want to go ahead and right-click and hit Settings from within the VM, and we want to go into the Storage tab. And then from the Storage tab, there's a couple changes we want to make. The first one is going to be adding another hard drive, and this is going to be the hard drive that our actual image is going to be stored on. So go ahead and click that. We're going to go ahead and hit Create, and then Create, just go ahead and click the first one, the VDI, hit Next. And go ahead and leave all this default, hit Next. For the size, yeah, 80 gigs should be fine. This is all going to depend on how big your image is. Now, if you're making a Windows 11 image that's bigger than 80 gigs, then you might want to think about some of the software that you're installing by default. You might want to cut it down a little bit. So it's going to take one heck of a thumb drive and it's going to take longer to install. But go ahead and pick your size and hit Finished. And at this point, we can go ahead and we can move down to the bottom. Unfortunately, my screen here cut it off. And we can select the Windows 11-1 VDI, the one we just created, and we can hit Choose. And at that point, it throws it into our controller here. So it'll show up into the virtual machine as another hard drive. And now we want to go ahead and click on the ISO image. And since we're not going to be using the Windows 11 ISO anymore, what we're going to be using now is we want to boot into Windows PE at this point. So to do that, go ahead and click on this little icon right on the side of the SATA port for the optical drive right here. We want to click that and we want to hit Choose a Disk File. And from that point, we're going to pick our Windows PE install and then hit Open. Now, at the next point, this is really important right here because we want to make sure that we boot off of this Windows PE install right here. And unfortunately, it's not as easy as you might think. But let me show you how to do it. Once you select that ISO, go ahead and hit OK. And now once you hit Start, you got to get quick with your hand right here because this is going to kind of make or break how you're going to boot up into Windows. So once you hit Start, wait until the black screen shows up. And as soon as the black screen shows up, you want to hit the Escape key. And by hitting the Escape key, what it does is it throws the VirtualBox into its boot menu. Now, the reason why we have to do this is because with Windows 11, we have to boot in a UEFI mode. And unfortunately, VirtualBox still has a bug in it where it won't allow you to change the boot order for different devices. It'll still boot into the operating system no matter what. Now, we want to change the boot device to go to Boot Manager, and then we want to select our CD-ROM right here. As you can see, the VBox CD-ROM VB1 is the one we want. We don't want to pick any of the other ones. We want to make sure to pick the CD-ROM right there. And once we hit Enter, then it'll go ahead and boot under Windows PE. It's going to take a minute to boot, so we'll go ahead and let this go through its process, and then once it boots, I'll meet you in Hiren's BootCD. So if you accidentally don't make it and you don't hit escape fast enough, then go ahead and let it boot all the way up into Windows and then just shut it down. Don't finish setup. You want to make sure that setup doesn't finish because you don't want to create a user account because that user account will get transferred to the image that we're going to be creating. But you shouldn't have to go into the system prep again. You should just be able to shut it down and it should be okay. So let's get back to it and I'll show you the next step. Okay, so now that we're in Hiren's BootCD, there's a couple things that we're gonna have to do. The first one is gonna be, we have to format that hard drive we just created. So go ahead and right click on this PC and click on Manage. And then from Manage, we wanna go into Disk Management. Now, as soon as we open Disk Management, it's gonna detect that there's a new drive. Just go ahead and hit OK. Now, as you can see, our disk 0 is going to be the drive that we originally set up Windows on. And then disk 1 is gonna be the 80 gig drive that we just created. Now, where it says unallocated here, we wanna go ahead and right click and hit New Simple Volume, hit Next, and we can assign it letter D, that's fine, hit Next. And then for the volume label, I would go ahead and put a volume label here. For mine, I'm just gonna write scratch because this is gonna be a scratch disk, but you can write whatever you want on yours. Hit Next and hit Finish. And then it's gonna take a second to format it, and it's already done. We can go ahead and close this. Now, what we're gonna wanna look at, what's important for this next step is what drive is what. So as you can see, we have a C drive and a D drive. Now, our scratch drive is gonna be our D drive. We already know that because we already created it just a second ago. And our C drive is gonna be our operating system drive. Once you've figured out what those two drives are, then we can move on to the next step. And that's gonna be opening up our command prompt here. And once with command prompt open, all we have to do is run one command, but it's a really long command. So let me explain it to you. So we type in DISM space, and then for this one, we want to capture an image. So we're going to go / capture dash image space. Then we want to do another / and we want to tell it where we want to save this image at. So for that, we're going to type in ImageFile : and then we want to give it the path. So go ahead and hit your quotation marks if your path has spaces and stuff in it. If it doesn't, you probably don't need quotation marks, but it's always nice to use them anyway. And then for this, it's going to be D drive : install.wim. Now that name is really important. Go ahead and close it off with another quotation mark also. And it's really important that you install it install.wim because that's going to correspond with the install WIM that's on our USB thumb drive. That's actually what we're going to be creating. And it's going to save this to our scratch drive that we just created. Now, we're going to have to tell it now what drive we want it to capture. And for that, we're going to hit / CaptureDir : and then after this, all we have to do is write C : /. And that's essentially, we're going to be capturing the entire C drive. Go ahead and hit space, and then we want to name our install of Windows. So for that, I'm going to name it, type in name : and then whatever name you want to give it. I'm going to give mine Cyber CPU 11 because it's going to be my custom version of Windows 11. And then the next setting we have to do is we want to actually compress this installed WIM because, the more we can compress it, the more we can save space on our USB thumb drive. Now, unfortunately, we're not going to be creating an ESD file, which compresses it even more, but we are going to compress the WIM. And to do that, we want to hit / compress : max, and that'll give it the max compression. Now it's going to take a little bit longer to create the image by compressing it, but in the long run, it will save us a considerable amount of space. And then later on in the end of the video, I'll show you how to convert the WIM to an ESD to give you even more compression so you can fit it onto a smaller USB drive. But once that's done, go ahead and hit enter, and it should start the DISM tool in order to create the image. Now, this is going to take quite a while because we're imaging the entire C drive that we had just created in the VM previously. So just give it some time, let it finish its thing, and then once it's done, we'll move on to the next step. And as you can see here, I'm sitting at 1%. So it's going to take quite a bit of time. So go ahead and let it finish its thing. And it's going to take a while, but once it's done, we can move on to the next step. Okay, so that finished up, and with the Programs that I installed, it only took about 10 minutes, but this is going to depend on how many programs that you want to include in your setup. So the more programs, obviously, the more time it's going to take. So once this is finished, you can go ahead and close this window. And at that point, we can open up our scratch drive and you can see the install WIM is on our flash drive. Now, the next thing we want to do is we want to actually get this install WIM onto a regular system. And in order to do that, we have to put it onto the thumb drive that we created all the way back at the beginning of the video. And to do that, I still have that thumb drive plugged into my computer. So all I got to do is right click on this little USB device here. And then we want to pick this unknown device. That's the name of my thumb drive. If you have a name brand thumb drive, then it should have a brand name right here. But I know this is the thumb drive that I'm using because I went through this process when I was writing this video. So we're going to go ahead and click that. And then that'll install that thumb drive onto this computer. And then once we open it, we can see that here is our Windows 11 installer. Now, what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to go into the sources folder. And then from the sources folder, I would recommend organizing things by size. And then install WIM, as you can see, we have a 5.8 gigabyte install WIM, and we're going to be replacing it with a 6.4 gigabyte. So we've added almost a gigabyte of information to the WIM file. And like I said, if you installed more programs, your WIM file is going to be a lot bigger. So what we want to do is we want to go ahead and delete the one that's on the USB drive because we're not going to need that anymore. So go ahead and delete that. And then once it's gone, we can take the install WIM that we created, drag it over, and drop it into our sources folder. And then this is going to take a minute to copy, and it's going to all depend on how big the file is. In fact, it's going to take 3 minutes and 30 seconds. So I'm going to go ahead and let that finish, and we'll move on to the next step. Okay, so now that the install WIM has copied all the way over to the USB drive, we can go ahead and close all of these windows, and we can shut down the machine. Now, at this point, you can take this thumb drive and install it on any computer you want, and it will include the applications that you installed earlier in the setup process. So I'm going to go ahead and install this onto a VM so we can test to see how it worked. Let's jump on it. Okay, since I'm doing a VM, unfortunately, I'm going to have to use an ISO instead of my USB thumb drive. However, you can go ahead and modify an ISO in exactly the same way that we modified the USB thumb drive. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to Machine and hit New. We're going to create, I'm going to call this one Cyber CPU 11, just like I named the image earlier. And then for the ISO image, I'm going to go ahead and pick the actual ISO file that I downloaded right here. And as you can see, I was playing around with Windows 10 too, so I tested this out in 10 just to make sure that it will work. And it does work very well. I'm going to go ahead and hit Skip Unattended Installation. We're going to hit Next. We're going to change this to 4 CPUs just like before. And we're going to change this to 250 gigs and then hit Next. And at this point, we can hit Finish. Now, we can hit Start, and it should start the setup process like it would normally. So we're going to go ahead and fire it up here, and we're going to skip through the setup process kind of quickly to make it kind of go a little bit faster so we don't have to sit here and wait for Windows to set up. So what I'll do is I'm going to jump through the first part, this part right here, because this is all stuff that you've seen before. And I'm going to jump into the out-of-box experience, and we'll go from there. Okay, so here we are in the Windows out-of-box experience. This is where we jumped into audit mode before, but now, unfortunately, because I'm using an ISO and not my thumb drive, the Rufus modifications haven't been made to this ISO. So I do have to get around the Microsoft account requirements in the more traditional way. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to go ahead and disconnect my network adapter real quick. And then I'm going to go through the process like I normally would. In fact, honestly, you don't even really have to go through this process. If you hit Shift F10, and then from there, you can just type the OOBE / bypass NRO, and it'll go ahead and restart the system and put you into it'll modify the out-of-box experience to allow you to bypass the Microsoft account, if that makes any sense. Anyway, that's not really what this video is about. That's just so we can get Windows installed on this VM so we can show that our image actually did work. Okay, so we're back into the out-of-box experience now. So at this point, just go through the process just like you normally would. Go ahead and answer all the questions. This should be the same as any other Windows install. Now, the only difference is because we use the bypass NRO, I can say I don't have internet right now, and it'll let me go ahead and continue with a limited setup, and it'll let me use a regular local account. So I'm going to go ahead and type my name here, hit Next. We're going to hit nothing for a password. I'm gonna go ahead and all these you can check no to. I'm not gonna worry about it right now because this install of Windows is going to last about 30 seconds, just so we can see that all of our apps are installed, and then we're gonna shut it down. This is the normal propaganda that comes up on the screen while it's setting up a new account. It's gonna take a minute to get through it, but then once it does, hopefully we'll see all of our third-party applications installed already. All right, so here we are in Windows. Now, as you can see, we have our network disconnected, so our icons didn't show up, but we do have all of our third-party apps already installed. So I'm gonna go ahead and turn the network back on, and then at that point, it should go ahead and install all of the different applications and things of that nature. Now, if you don't want this stuff installed, you can always go through and de-bloat this as well, but that wasn't really what this video was about. This video was about adding these different programs. And as you can see, these programs should work just like they normally would. And you didn't have to install them. They just came with Windows, essentially. But at this point, we can go ahead and shut this down and we can move on to the next step. So now that you have this USB created, you can go ahead and use this all you want. You can use this to install Windows on any system that you want. You're still going to need, obviously, a license for each computer that you set it up on. However, the nice thing about this is that now that you have it set up, you can go ahead and make changes and modifications to it anytime that you want, just by following the same process we did before. However, the more applications that you install on this USB drive, the bigger the USB drive is going to get. So in that case, compression is really important, especially if you want to install this on smaller USB drives, like maybe be able to get to the 8 GB drives that you normally would need for a Windows install. So for that, I'm going to show you how to convert the WIM to an ESD file, which gives you a little bit better compression. Let's do that now. Okay, so to set up an ESD file, all we got to do is plug our USB drive back into the computer. We can close VirtualBox now because we're not going to need that anymore. And we're going to go ahead and open up this PC, and we're going to see that our USB drive is drive E. Now this is going to be important because we want to know where the install WIM is located at. And we also want to take a look at what the size of this thing is too. And as you can see, it is 6.19 gigabytes. So once that's done, we're going to go ahead and minimize this, and we're going to go ahead and start CMD. And then we want to make sure to run this as an administrator here. And then from here, we want to type another simple command. We're going to be using DISM again, but this time instead of capture image, we want to export image. So we want to do / export dash image space, and then we want to tell it what the source file is. And the source file is going to be the WIM file that's on our USB drive. So for that, we're going to do / we're going to do source image file colon, and then we're going to use our parentheses here, and we're going to drive E drive / sources / install.wim, and then we're going to close that off with our parentheses again, and then we're going to hit space. We're going to do / source index, which this is going to depend on which version of Windows you're trying to do. Now, as we created this with Windows 11 Pro. This isn't a Pro and Home version. This install is Pro alone. So in this case, we're just going to do, if you followed my directions the way that I did it, we're going to do :1 because there is only one source image. Now we're going to hit space again. We're going to do a /, and for this we want to know the destination image. So we're going to go destination image file :, and then for this one, I'm just going to put parentheses C : / install.esd, and then close that off with parentheses again. Now I'm throwing this onto my C drive because it just makes it kind of more simple to be able to know where exactly I put it. So instead of writing C, users, rich, and the whole path to my desktop, I'm just going to throw it right on the C drive, and it's okay. We can pull it off of there later. So now that we did that, we want to go ahead and tell it / compression, and that's going to be compress, and then : recovery. And now I don't know why the setting compress recovery is the way it is. It's just what you do, and it should compress it more than the WIM. And then at that point, we're going to do / check CheckIntegrity. And then once we do that, we can go ahead and push enter, and it'll go ahead and use DISM to convert the WIM we created earlier into an ESD that should be compressed more than the ESD is. Now, the reason we didn't do this in the VM is because it takes an incredible amount of memory to do. If you open up your task manager, and as you can see, my system is actually running a little slower right now. You'll notice that my CPU is at 100% and my memory usage is pretty high. I mean, I've got 32 gigs of memory on the system and I'm currently using 12. And it turns out that about 8 gigs of that is just for this image conversion. And then also, the CPU is essentially maxed out. So you don't want to do the WIM to ESD conversion from within the VM. It's just going to take too long. You want to do this on the bare metal so you have more performance. But now we can go ahead and close this and let it finish. It's at 2% right now, so it's going to take a minute to finish. Well, look, 4 or 5%. So it's actually going pretty quick. But once it finishes, we will move on to the next step. So I was sitting here waiting for this to finish, and I just wanted to point this out real quick. And as you can see, we're at 17%. We've been running for a minute or two since I flipped over and paused the recording. However, I wanted to get back to it just to show you this. So right now, the DISM service is currently using 92% of the CPU and 8.5 gigabytes of RAM, and it's running at about 30-ish megabytes a second that it's using on the disk. Luckily, it's not using much disk usage, but it is using a little bit. However, most of it is going to be memory and CPU. So if you don't have at least a minimum of 8 gigs of RAM free, I'm not talking about 8 gigs total, I'm talking about 8 gigs free to be able to handle this service right here, then you're not going to be able to change a WIM to an ESD. Unfortunately, you need to have a minimum of 8 gigs of RAM available to even run this. If you don't, then it'll actually give you an error saying it's out of memory. When I was going through the process, I actually was trying to do this from within the VM originally, and it almost immediately said it was out of memory because, as you know, we created the VM with 4 gigabytes of RAM, and because it only had 4 gigs of RAM, it definitely didn't have 8 gigs free. Anyway, so hopefully that'll point out so you can actually skip this step if you don't have 8 gigs free on your system, because you're gonna need it, unfortunately. So if you do decide that you do have the resources to do this conversion, it should save you a pretty good amount of space on your USB drive. So once this finishes, I'll show you the next step. All right, so now that that finished up, it took probably twice as much time to create the ESD than it did to create the original image for the WIM file. But after that's done, we can go ahead and close this. And we can go ahead and jump into our file explorer here. And remember, we saved our new ESD file onto the C drive. So once we go there, you'll see that here it is, and it's 4.9 gigs. And as you can see, that's a pretty substantial difference from our original 6.4. So we've saved well over a gigabyte of space. Now to use this ESD file in place of the WIM, it's pretty simple. All you got to do is delete the original WIM file. And then once that's deleted, go ahead and copy the ESD file over to the sources folder. And it's going to take a second to copy because it's still a pretty large file. It looks like it's going to take us 1 minute and 30 seconds. So we're going to go ahead and let that finish, and we're going to see what we're left with at the end. Okay, so we have it copied over now. We're going to go ahead and jump down to this PC. And we're going to right click and hit properties for our drive. Now, as you can see, the used space on the drive is 5.59 gigabytes, which should be plenty of space to be able to use this install on a regular 8 gigabyte drive. Now, this is all going to depend on how much space you took up. And yours is going to be different than mine because the programs that you decide to install in the initial setup step is going to depend on what the ultimate space you're going to use. So if you want to be able to use this install on an 8 gigabyte drive like you would a normal Windows 10 or 11 install, then you have to make sure to kind of limit the programs that you're going to set up so that they stay within that range. However, this gives you at least the tools that you need to at least have a fighting chance to get as close to 8 gigs as you want. However, like I said, the ESD compression does take some resources. So if your system isn't capable of being able to create the ESD, then you're going to be stuck. But as you can see, since we're only using 5.59 gigabytes, we could have fit this on an 8 gigabyte drive, even with the WIM file. So you shouldn't have too much to worry about. It's only going to be if you have tons of programs that you install that take up a ton of space. And if you do, well, then you may have to have a bigger thumb drive to install Windows on. So there you go. You can now include all the third-party apps that you would typically install after Windows and just include them in the setup process. This should save you a ton of time setting up Windows. I know that I'm going to be doing this from now on so I can recover some of that time that I spend setting up customer systems. Now, even though I didn't get into debloating, you can combine this process with other processes that I've shown you in the past. In fact, a great candidate for that process could be combined with the one that we did just last week. I'll go ahead and leave a link to that right here and you can check it out. In that video, we create an auto unattended XML that can be used to modify the Windows setup further, including debloating. As always, you guys have a great day.